You're likely at a point now where you've got a public health related topic in mind, and you may have some understanding of the public health significance and how many people may be affected by the disease or the problem identified by your topic. So now you've got to get to a point where you are trying to figure out how can we do better with respect to that topic, and how do we do better may be best addressed by a more narrow research question. So how do you form your research question? So the steps of developing your research question first ought to start off with understanding what is known versus what is unknown. Now, what's unknown is where we want to get. Your contributions ideally will be novel or will add value to the field in that you are a master of public health students. So in the sciences, when we already know the information, we would call that background information. So when you're doing research that is trying to answer a question where the knowledge is already known, we call that a background question. And examples of those types of questions might be something like, does increasing amounts of PM 2.5 exposure increase cardiovascular disease risk? And we know already by an overwhelming amount of literature that that is true. They may not have been able to demonstrate that 50, 60 years ago, or even maybe 30 years ago. It used to be known that PM10 did this, but as we've gotten better at measuring things, we know that PM2.5 definitely does this. Other questions, 70 years ago, did cigarette smoking increase lung cancer risk? Probably did, but did they really know it? Well, we definitely know it now. So these are background questions. Nobody's going to be doing research asking whether or not cigarette smoking increases lung cancer risk. Now, something that might be more on the forefront would be something like, does vaping increase lung cancer risk? Another background question might be something like, how is lung cancer diagnosed? Or how is asthma diagnosed? That information is already known. So those types of questions are often viewed as a bit more elementary. Your research question should not be a background question, but rather be a foreground question. So what makes something a foreground question? So we're going to move to that. Well, foreground questions generally are more often asked by experts. As you get more and more familiar with your topic, you'll be very familiar with a lot of the background questions. Now, you may not necessarily identify yourself as an expert, but you're on this continuum and you're heading towards expert status. So the questions that you should be asking, or you will get better at asking, should be addressing foreground questions. So what differentiates a novice from an expert in doing research? So starting with novice training, when you are a novice and you're writing a research paper, you're often thinking about, how do I find information? How do I ask good questions for understanding what work has been done? What should I put into the search engine? What should I search at the library? The novice will also be viewing research as an endeavor to make sense of information and findings that have already been observed. Now, we're going to move into what makes you an expert researcher. The expert researcher will still have all the skills that they would have obtained from when they were a novice researcher. So they have all those novice skills and they know how to use and obtain background information. But they then figure out how to use the background information to ask the questions that are at the forefront, that we would call the foreground questions, on matters of importance whereby the current knowledge is either non-existent or it's really limited. So we're moving you from being a novice towards being an expert researcher. Now, if you want to get to full-blown expert researchers, many of the experts still may not even want to accept the identification of being an expert, but you will have a master of public health, and a master of public health is far from being a novice. So If you're more comfortable only doing background research, then maybe a Master of Public Health was not where you should be. But we believe that you are able to be successful in this area, and we want you to move more towards the expert side of the continuum. Your employers are going to be looking for you to solve new problems, not just take information that's already known. So foreground questions, they can be quantitative, qualitative, or they can use a mixed methods kind of question approach. So quantitative questions or quantitative research-based questions will have their questions asked in a way that will enable the collection of data and will enable you to test your hypotheses using like numerical measurements or quantities. Qualitative research gathers richer information. Also, it's probably more subjective, and it's typically more open-ended, and it's harder to kind of evaluate using numerical approaches. So it gathers more information often from individuals, so sample sizes may be lower, but the questions that are asked are going to allow more information to be able to be obtained. So higher quality data in, but harder for actually taking that information and using it for communicating to others. The foreground research questions that are out there for quantitative methods, particularly quantitative public health methods, often use these PICO model approaches. Qualitative public health foreground questions use the PS model. So what goes into this PICO model? So here we go. We got the P, the I or the E, the C, and the O. So when you're developing your research question, you should be thinking about what population am I going to focus on? Am I focusing on the whole world? Am I focusing on the whole United States? Am I focusing on people in Appalachia? Am I focusing on people in Kentucky? Am I focusing on non-Hispanic whites in Appalachian Kentucky? Am I focusing on black populations in the Midwest? You have to identify who you're focusing your work on. Secondly, on the I, what are you going to be asking about? Are you asking about whether or not an intervention, like an educational model or a drug, or whether it's an environmental exposure, is actually kind of related in some way to that population of interest? Also, who are you going to compare with? So in the sciences, we have a bit of an experimental design method here too. So you should usually have a comparison group. Or in some cases in the environmental health sciences, nobody is truly unexposed, so your comparison group is maybe a continuum of folks exposed to low levels versus folks exposed to higher levels. And then what are you measuring as an outcome? Are people more likely to have the disease as a measure, like number of cases per 10,000? Are people more likely to have the healthy aspect of whatever it is that you're trying to measure? Maybe did people quit smoking or not? So there's a variety of different types of outcomes that you may have. But regardless, when you're asking a research question, it should be identifying all of these. So who are you measuring? What are you measuring about them? How are you going to compare it? And what's the disease or improvement condition of interest? Qualitative research, it focuses on who is the population, or if you're just interviewing individual patients, and then you're asking them about or gathering information about them related to a particular situation, maybe a recent diagnosis, maybe a behavior or activity that they engage in, and you're trying to figure out why they do it. So that is in the qualitative research area. Now, your research topic that you started off with is likely more generalizable, it's bigger, as you start narrowing it down, you're going to have a research question that is more narrow than the research topic. The next step in kind of the research methodology here is to then move on to the research hypothesis, which is more specific. If you have any questions, you can email me at jason.marion@eku.edu, and you also have my cell phone number through the emails and things like that on Blackboard. In our next presentation, we're going to focus on the research hypothesis or research hypotheses that you may develop, as well as how to understand the difference between the null and the alternate hypothesis. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.